Tantor Audio, a division of recorded books, presents Aphrodite in Bloom, a collection of erotic stories, by Anonymous, narrated by Isobelle Fox. The Gift. The Gift is a fun little tale of a sexually curious virgin that will leave you grinning. However, the story includes one brief incident of a man striking his nephew, so listeners who may be sensitive to this, please take note. Chapter 1. Lady Elizabeth's aunt always turned up with at least one gift for her favourite niece. This latest offering was the most surprising and generous ever. A coming-out ball and the name of a potential husband. Lizzie's mother did not approve. She blistered the ears of Lizzie's father, the Duke of Knightsmore, behind the door of his study, insisting he put a stop to Auntie Blythe's interference. Auntie Blythe had outlived 2 husbands and birthed a son to each, securing 2 fortunes in the process. It made her, as she described herself, that most fearsome of creatures to men, an obscenely rich woman in possession of beauty, intelligence, and influence. She wanted the same for Lizzie. The Marquess of San Teodoro is a perfect match for her, Auntie Blythe declared, as if it were that easy to snare a proposal from the richest, most notorious rake to set foot in London in decades. Victor the Virile, as he'd been dubbed behind society fans, was 24. He'd brought his inherited fortune to England, where he could invest in trade ships that weren't taken by pirates as quickly as they appeared on the horizon. His holdings included land in the Kingdom of Sardinia, America, and India. He was nephew to the Prince of Carignano, a close friend of the Prince Regent's. Lizzie may be the daughter of a duke, but a marquess of his connections and wealth was out of her league. And, as her mother screeched at her father, he was wildly inappropriate. He was foreign. Victor was also reputed to have serviced a scandalous number of women since his arrival, not that her mother said that part out loud. Lizzie had heard it from friends. She had pretended to be scandalized, as any virgin should be, but she'd glimpsed Victor from afar once. His dark, arrogant looks had caused a tingle between her thighs. Her infatuation was futile, though. She was doomed to accept the suitor her mother had picked out for her. Lizzie loved her mother, but she was hideously practical. Auntie Blythe, on the other hand, was worldly and witty and, yes, given to drowning Lizzie in presents and treats and tete-a-tetes that were very enlightening. "Let me tell you what happened on my 15th birthday," Auntie Blythe had said 3 years ago as she and Lizzie celebrated Lizzie's special day with brewed chocolate adorned with whipped cream and orange blossoms. "A man was staying in our home. I won't tell you his name, but he had very close ties to the court in Vienna. He seduced me. Now, you might wonder what is involved in such a thing. I will tell you." Lizzie had learned, as Auntie Blythe had called it, the ins and outs of marital relations. She spared no details on how a man's body fit with a woman's, and how his caresses might stray in exciting and shocking ways. She had explained that a woman should find pleasure in it, but that a powerful man with charm and experience could use the intriguing, mysterious pleasures of her response to coerce her into believing herself in love. Before she knew it, she was ruined. Lizzie's mother had nearly suffered apoplexy when she realized what Auntie Blythe had revealed. "I don't want Lizzie taken advantage of the way I was," Auntie Blythe said without remorse. There had been a huge row. Auntie Blythe had left for the continent, only returning recently. Lizzie had been punished too. Her friends had begun coming out, but her mother had made every excuse to keep Lizzie from balls and parties and fun. She wouldn't have her turn out like Auntie Blythe. It would have been a dreary punishment indeed if Lizzie had not taken Auntie Blythe's advice. Take matters into your own hands. Understand the power of your own pleasure, so no man can use it against you. Lizzie didn't have words for the rush of urgent joy that overcame her when she touched herself late at night, alone in her bed. How could anyone describe it? It was no wonder her aunt had been overthrown when that older man made her feel such things. 2 things brought Auntie Blythe back to London. Ostensibly, she returned to attend the Prince of Wales's fete at Carlton House, celebrating his assumption of the regency. Lizzie believed, however, it had been her mention of David in her letters. At 32, he had inherited a healthy earldom and a seat in the House of Lords. Lizzie's father was mentoring him. Lizzie's mother threw him at Lizzie every chance she found. Auntie Blythe wasted no time in offering to host her niece's coming-out ball, setting a date after Easter, effectively blocking Lizzie's mother from marrying Lizzie off before she'd had a proper season to see for herself what's out there. Her mother was incensed. "This is how she behaves," she had railed behind the door to Lizzie's father. "And you let her." Lizzie had tuned out the shouting. She was ecstatic to have a ball. She had kissed David and let him squeeze her breast, but she felt cheated at having no other experience, especially when the mere thought of Victor excited her far more than the real-life attentions of dull David. Her ball became the event of the season, mostly because Lizzie's mother ruthlessly vetted the guest list, making it very exclusive. Victor the Virile would not be invited. She had stroked a line through his name 3 times, to be sure. Lizzie was annoyed by that, but her aunt proposed at the last minute it to be a masked ball. The party became more anticipated than ever. The day arrived, and Lizzie was a bundle of giddiness, but she had no one with whom to share her feelings. Her friends were in their own homes, preparing for the evening. Her mother was lying down with a headache. Lizzie's 3 older brothers were the furthest thing from interested. Only Auntie Blythe would find all of this as diverting as Lizzie, and Lizzie wouldn't see her until tonight. With a sigh, she dismissed her maid and indulged herself with opening all the gifts and parcels and packages that had arrived for her. There were new petticoats and hose and the satin dancing slippers that her aunt had ordered from London shops and forwarded on to her. Friends had sent her hair ribbons and eau de toilette, sheet music and embroidered handkerchiefs. Lizzie spent ages opening and admiring all of it, feeling spoiled and special, and wondering if this was how her wedding day would feel. She was about to ring her maid to put everything away when she shifted a hat box and discovered with delight that it held one final gift. It was a pretty ebony box with gold initials from a jeweller she hadn't heard of. Inside, she found 2 gold charms about the size and shape of robin's eggs. They each had a slit in the narrow end for the accompanying ribbon to tie into. As she handled them, she realized each held a weight of some kind, one that moved freely to cause a fine vibration in the golden shell. The ribbon was a lovely, soft silk in pale blue, and there was a full ream of it. Why so much? Was it a necklace? A chatelaine? And who was it from? Ah, a note. Drat, Latin. Well, thanks to Auntie Blythe, she had been educated in Latin, along with Italian, French, and German. Still, it took her a few minutes to work out that the note advised her to measure 2 loops of ribbon around the woman's waist. That length should secure the eggs and provide enough slack to introduce them into her passage. Into her? That couldn't mean. Lizzie nearly crumpled the note in her guilty haste to hide from the explicit thought that leaped into her mind. Because it couldn't be true. She searched the box but couldn't find anything to identify who might have sent it. Were these eggs really meant to be introduced into her passage? She read and reread, growing less scandalized and more intrigued. The more she thought about trying it, the more a tantalizing dampness settled in her passage. Swallowing, she went so far as to cut the recommended length of ribbon. She tied off the eggs with a firm knot. Where would they go if they came loose from the ribbon? She doubled each knot, then tied it around her waist over top her dress. She let the eggs dangle against her skirt, as she considered whether to do as the note suggested. Was this a rite of passage, that no one had warned her about? Had her friends done it and not said a word? Lizzie didn't talk about anything deeply personal with her friends, only with Auntie Blythe, whom she trusted to always be honest and forthright. Why hadn't she warned her of this? Well, considering the eruption after Auntie Blythe had enlightened her on marital relations, Lizzie had her answer. She put the eggs back into their box and tucked it away, then called her maid to tidy up while she took tea in the drawing room, pondering what to do. As she sat there, she realized her mother wasn't lying down. She was berating her father. Again. "David is a good match," her mother insisted. "He's English. You agreed when I suggested him. Yet you'll allow her to parade other men before her. What if she changes Lizzie's mind?" "She wants to give our girl a night of dancing," her father said in a beleaguered rumble. "You're overreacting. Nothing will happen." "You always take her side against me." A door slammed and a potent silence reigned. Lizzie let out a despondent sigh, fearing her father was right. Nothing would happen. She would be boxed into a life with David, arguing with him about her own daughter's prospects, and never know the independence and empowerment Auntie Blythe enjoyed. Unless she took matters into her own hands. Chapter 2. Some hours later, Lizzie was dressed as far as her petticoat when she dismissed her maid on a benign errand and retrieved the eggs from where she'd hidden them. If she had been wearing a busk in her corset, she might have needed her maid to help her, but she was able to gather up her petticoat herself. She set a foot on a chair and brought the linen beneath her armpits as she tied the ribbon around her waist. Then she set the first cool golden egg against her mound. She'd been thinking about this all afternoon, so she wasn't surprised to find her curls were damp. She caressed into her slit with her finger first, parting her slick folds and searching out the source of her wetness. There. She often imagined what it might feel like to have a man's thick member pushing into that tight, wet aperture. The fantasy never failed to stimulate her to the point of delivering the rush of deliciousness she so enjoyed. She didn't have time this evening to soothe her tingling flesh. She pushed the first golden egg into her cavity. What a strange sensation! There was a pinch, then an awareness of the cool weight sitting at her entrance. She might have given herself more time to debate whether this was a good feeling, or even a good idea, but her maid would return any moment. She pushed the second one in. It forced the first egg higher, tightening the pinch. It wasn't unbearable and quickly faded to a dull ache. That vague discomfort and the light pressure of the ribbon sitting in the channel of her slit trained her focus firmly on her loins. The sensation of fullness was pleasant, and she was teased again with the idea of a man moving within her. Flushed with a type of heat she only ever incited in herself when she was abed, she hurried to drop her petticoat and rinse her hands at the basin. As she crossed the room, something happened. It wasn't the cataclysm that happened when she touched herself, but it was a suggestion of that climactic feeling. She was instantly primed for wanting to rub herself while shivering in something like the aftermath of having done so. It was so startling and lovely, she stood still to absorb it, only coming back to herself when her maid returned. Lizzie schooled her expression while she allowed the girl to help her finish dressing. The act of raising her arms and shifting and turning became a fine torture that redoubled her stimulation. She ought to remove the eggs. If this went on all evening, she was liable to betray that she was affected. But this sensual awareness was appealing, too. She felt as though she'd drunk a full glass of unwatered wine, something she'd done on a handful of occasions when her mother wasn't looking. It always warmed her beneath her skin and made her think scandalous thoughts. As the maid put the final touches on her dress, Lizzie gazed at her image in the mirror, but she could barely focus. Her satin gown was white, with a sawtooth trim, in a colour inspired by the Chartreuse liquor made by French monks. The sheer silk overlay was embroidered in a similar way, and her wrap was that same matching green. Her silky brunette hair had been skimmed into piles of curls atop her head, surrounded in bright leaves and white roses. It had seemed very virginal and girlish when her mother had pressed her to agree to it. Lizzie put on her mask of green feathers, however, and now all she saw was a forest nymph with flushed cheeks and plump lips, and a sheen of exhilaration in her dark brown eyes. She looked like a dryad who enticed peasants into sinning against the gods. "Your parents are waiting, miss," the maid reminded. Of course. In a haze of prickling awareness, Lizzie moved down the hall and descended the stairs. The tiny egg sat inside her like the iniquitous knowledge instilled by Eve's apple. Her mother frowned as Lizzie appeared. Her father said an absent, "You look lovely, very grown up," and offered his arm to take her to the carriage. Her brothers were making their own way to the ball separately, so, minutes later, they were away, which was when Lizzie realized what a horrific mistake she'd made. The pitch and roll of the carriage over the cobblestones set the eggs to jiggling inside her. If they hadn't been muffled by her flesh, she was sure they would have sung pretty notes. She certainly felt the joyous tune they produced. Thank goodness it was dark. She closed her eyes several times, but had to focus on keeping her breathing steady and not gasping as the subtle vibration subjected her to unrelenting stimulation. She heard her mother at a distance, lecturing that Lizzie must dance with David and never another man twice. And she mustn't talk about... Lizzie's ears seemed to fill with water. She clenched her inner muscles, trying to resist the tension coiling within her. That only seemed to intensify the feeling, pushing her to greater heights of yearning. Her breasts felt as though they wanted to burst from her bodice. Her loins were growing wet enough to dampen her petticoat. What if she soaked through her gown? Culmination remained frustratingly out of reach, though. She began to obsessively think of lifting her skirt to rub away the liquid ache thrumming in her flesh. But here they were now, slowing outside her aunt's home. She had to depart the carriage and climb the steps. "No need to be nervous, pet," her father said, making her realize she was trembling and clinging to his sleeve. "I'm fine," she lied, but thought everyone who saw her must know she verged on sexual culmination. Her aunt gave her a warm embrace. Lizzie longed to ask her about the eggs, but was forced to collect herself and stand in the receiving line with her aunt and parents. She was so self-conscious she could barely pay attention to which names were said in relation to which masked faces as the season's crop of eligible bachelors arrived. All she knew was that Victor's name was not spoken, but David's was. His dark blonde hair and smooth, square jaw were impossible to disguise anyway. He paid her some ridiculous compliment about how she was glowing. She was so abashed, she blushed, which made him smile in a way that suggested he thought he was having an effect on her. She was such a fool. Why had she worn this silly device? The house became a crush of warm bodies. Auntie Blythe wanted to open the doors to allow people into the back garden, but first she brought Lizzie to the ballroom. The crowd oohed as they encircled the edges of the floor where mythical creatures had been chalked onto its surface. "It's too pretty to ruin, Auntie," Lizzie insisted, and heard someone bemoan a new pair of satin slippers. "If it's not a race by the end of the evening, it won't have been a successful ball." A country dance began, and David appeared before Lizzie to claim it. Lizzie had been refining her footwork these last weeks, but struggled to remember the steps. She was so stimulated by the eggs inside her that she flushed with heat as she gave David her hands. They stepped in and then away, side left, brought their shoulders into line, then back, side right, and shoulders in line, then away again. "You look very beautiful," David told her, flickering his gaze to her bosom. Her neckline was the latest cut, wide and straight to expose her upper chest and shoulders. She was very aware of the air caressing the swell of her breasts where her corset pushed them up. Her nipples felt as though they sat beneath hard buttons and protested the restriction, aching to be freed. Her stomach was a whirl of sensual tension. Lizzie was working so hard not to betray herself, she almost forgot to say, "Thank you." Her loins were soaked, her inner thighs slippery with her juices. She began to fear the eggs would slip free, but almost longed for that to happen. The ribbon was rubbing in her folds as she moved. They took each other's right arm by the elbow and circled. Lizzie managed to say, "You dance very well." "You're so graceful you make me look better than I am." It was outright flattery, but she was so mindless she only took his left arm and circled, then went back to her position. The lively music forced the next move, which was a snaking figure eight through the line of dancers, while she maintained her eye contact with David. His gaze stayed pinned to hers in such a way she feared he could see how precariously she balanced on the brink of release. "You're incandescent," he told her when they came together. She felt herself completely engulfed in flames and clung to his hands an extra second before they quickly had to spin away and travel down the line where they met again. They were back to the beginning, repeating the first steps, clasping hands to step left and right, aligning their shoulders. It happened. Finally. Yet it didn't. In a frustrating twist of yearning and fulfillment, a gratifying rush of well-being rolled through her abdomen. The walls of her sheath shivered against the eggs lodged within her, but the usual flood of wet release didn't happen. The most intensely pleasurable pulses failed to manifest. She felt as though she'd caught a breath, but was instantly drowning again. Her gaze fluttered, causing David to raise a quizzical brow. She ought to be glad she wasn't completely overcome while on a ballroom floor. She wasn't relieved, though. She was clamouring with the same level of desire, while flushed with the peak she had reached. It was as delightful as it was vexing. The dance came to an end, thank heavens. They bowed, and David escorted her back to her mother. "I'll call on you later this week." The avid light in his eye was self-congratulatory. He assumed his dancing had caused her flustered reaction. Lizzie was still aroused enough that she wouldn't object to being deflowered right here in the middle of the ballroom, but she wasn't about to let him think he had won her so easily. She offered a cool smile. "If I miss you, we'll certainly see each other again this season. Now that I'm out, I'll attend all the parties." And she intended to, Mother. His swaggering confidence dimmed. He nodded and disappeared into the crowd while her mother glowered. "Don't toy with him, Lizzie." Her gaze narrowed. "Are you feeling yourself?" If only, Lizzie thought wistfully. "It's the heat. May I stand outside? I see Claire." She nodded at a friend who chatted with a mutual acquaintance. Her mother gave an impatient nod, and Lizzie slipped out to the terrace where she joined a group of young women who cooed over her dress and hair and the ball in general. Lizzie calmed a little as the damp night air cooled her hot cheeks and swirled beneath her dress. She made a point of standing quiet and still amid the gossiping women who were trying to guess the identity of masked guests. Her loins relaxed and settled, allowing her to almost forget the small eggs inside her. Victor slipped into the party through the garden, easily blending in with the guests who were strolling the grounds in search of darkened bowers where they could fondle and fuck. He noted the shoes of a man poking from beneath the voluminous skirt of a woman's billowed gown. She sat on a bench, head thrown back in ecstasy, so she didn't notice Victor. Such a lovely picture. Here he'd feared this party would be a dead bore. Anticipating a similar experience with a specific woman was the reason he'd bothered to turn up, despite his uncle explicitly warning him against showing his face. Easy to hide it at a masked ball. But Zio Piero had meant it. They were at odds lately. His uncle might be a prince and still lusty and distinguished, but Victor's youth and endurance had usurped his uncle's lifelong reputation as the most vigorous cock in town. He kept telling Victor he should be looking for a wife, since his fortune needed an heir. But how could Victor imagine settling for one woman when he was sought by all? Crones, widows, mothers, newlyweds, and virgins. Anyone who possessed a pussy, and even some men, were throwing themselves at him. Meanwhile, Piero was still trying to seduce the one woman he wanted. 2 weeks ago, at Zio Piero's musicale, Victor had crossed paths with the object of his uncle's desire. Lady Blythe Lavenham had asked Victor if he would like an invitation to her niece's coming-out ball. The idea of attending one of these over-chaperoned, non-tippling socials, where virgins were paraded beneath the noses of men ready to shackle themselves, was a firm "No, grazie." "Did my uncle ask you to invite me?" he had surmised. "He's otherwise engaged." Zio Piero had cut in firmly and drew the very comely Lady Blythe away, making it clear he feared his nephew had caught her interest. She was in her 30s and definitely intriguing, but one of the other women in attendance had soon begun a correspondence with him. She'd urged him to meet her at this party, unaware he wasn't invited. But what else was he to do with his evening? Anyone of consequence was here. And much to his delight, it wasn't nearly so tedious as he'd expected. The music was lively and, judging by the volume of conversation and laughter, alcohol was being served. Plus, there was a tantalizing mystery in not...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?